What makes you happy is a fundamental question to ask when wanting to live a good life, despite it being constantly bashed on by hustle culture and often disregarded as a momentary state. Happiness, joy, and satisfaction have become of rather secondary importance, making place for materialism and modern consumerism, as these two give a massive illusion of being more rational than just a momentary state, an object you can measure, weigh, that serves a purpose. Pursuing this seems so much more rational and smart instead of feelings like joy or satisfaction that are very much limited in time and hard to measure or compare. It very much feeds our internal desires of being cool, cold, and calculating like a machine, like we're obtaining this object of vital strategic importance, when in fact it's just a piece of junk. And behind this veil of rationality hides the same momentary desire to feel happy, satisfied, and joyful, even though a bit backwards and crooked. The exact moment of the purchase or right before the purchase is when the momentary state of joy occurs, just in a pseudo-rational and materialistic veil. So striving to be happy is a key component of life, and where you get that satisfaction and joy from plays an incredibly huge role in shaping you as a person. So understanding how happiness works can be detrimental if you want to reshape your life. So let's look at what happens in your brain, and let's start with the most famous substance, dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter as it transmits signals between neurons. It is mainly produced in these parts of the brain, and even though it's widely acknowledged and very popular, there are still loads of misconceptions about dopamine. The biggest one being that it's some kind of reward. The idea is you do something that the brain is programmed to find important, like eat or interact socially or exercise, and in return, you get dopamine. Seems plausible, but it's not entirely true. See, dopamine is not reward-based, but rather motivation and desire-based. Dopamine isn't necessary for someone to enjoy something, but crucial for someone to pursue a certain activity that leads to pleasure. Dopamine is also closely tied to movement. See, there are four dopaminergic pathways, and the so-called nigrostriatal pathway is responsible for voluntary movement. It's a really interesting pathway. You can look it up if you want to. But what you should take away from this video is that dopamine keeps you motivated and active to pursue pleasurable things, and technically even lets you physically move towards them. And as much as I hate, this practice of scrolling, it perfectly demonstrates how dopamine works. Imagine you saw like an extraordinary, fabulous piece of media while scrolling. Truly a piece of art, right? Either it was funny, interesting, or it has some other effect that made you feel good. Your brain remembers what preceded the pleasure, scrolling. So you can imagine scrolling being like hunting for entertainment for that perfect video, and dopamine being released to make you motivated to hunt or scroll.
Get it! 18! Get it! 19! Yeah!
And the next time you catch yourself scrolling, I want you to write down or make a mental note of how you feel. And you'll notice that in the moment, you don't really feel well or nice, probably kind of empty. Chances are you feel extremely unmotivated. The explanation for this is firstly, after you're done, dopamine levels plummet below baseline. No dopamine, no motivation. And also your brain, when hit with such an atrocious amount of dopamine, obviously wants to keep the dopamine balance, the dopamine homeostasis. So it reduces the number of dopamine receptors in the brain, making you less sensitive towards other dopamine releasing stimuli. This practice is commonly known as frying the living shit out of your dopamine receptors. So there are things that spike dopamine, meaning you have regular levels of dopamine, and then but after the spike, dopamine levels drop below baseline. And if the stimuli is strong enough, your brain decreases dopamine receptors. So should you stop doing these things? It depends. Some activities, definitely. Some activities you can reduce the frequency of, making them more enjoyable. Another thing is avoiding the stacking of multiple sources of dopamine. For example, scrolling while eating, and I know it hurts, but music while exercising. But as I said, you don't have to completely remove it, just reduce the frequency, so sometimes with and sometimes without music. So avoiding these huge spikes and the following drop where it's possible is one thing. Another thing is increasing tonic dopamine, so baseline dopamine. And of course, I'm going to recommend cold showers. I know it's almost cliche at this point because, cold showers, they make you invincible, boost testosterone by 500%, make you a millionaire, and whatnot. But what I can guarantee you is that it will increase your tonic dopamine and make you more motivated. Just try it out and let me know in the comments how it went. But the main point of the video is not motivation, so we'll jump ahead to happiness and the main character of this video, serotonin. Serotonin is a hugely important hormone and neurotransmitter, and will mainly be focusing on its effects to the brain. Serotonin is made from the amino acid tryptophan, and in the body, 90% of it is produced in the intestinal epithelium, so the surface of the small and large intestine, where it's responsible for bowel function and satiety. However, because serotonin cannot pass the blood-brain barrier, its precursor tryptophan, on the other hand, in the brain, serotonin is mainly made in the brainstem, in the Raphe nuclei, and travels in the serotonergic pathway in such manner. After synthesis, serotonin is stored in vesicles, which you can imagine like bubbles, that in this case travel to the end of an axon, the presynaptic terminal, releasing serotonin, and after the release, it's also reuptaken to the presynaptic neuron. And the reason I wanted to highlight this is because manipulating this mechanism, namely the latter reuptake part, has become the go-to way of treating depression. SSRI, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. As the name might suggest, inhibit the reuptake of serotonin by transporter proteins, making more serotonin available in the synaptic cleft to bind to their respective receptors. So, what does serotonin actually make you feel like? I already mentioned physically in the intestine, it makes you feel satiated, and psychologically, satiated is a good way to describe it. It makes us feel satisfied with what we have, content, and generally feeling well. Think more relaxed and calm, happy. It also plays a crucial role in sleep, as during the day is linked with increased wakefulness, which in turn is important for falling asleep and deep, slow wave sleep. Why? Well, I showed you the synthesis of serotonin, but what's synthesized from serotonin? Well, serotonin is actually converted into melatonin, the sleep onset hormone, which would definitely need its own entire episode. But for now, remember, melatonin strongly connected to serotonin. And so it raises the question, how would one go about optimizing serotonin and getting all these benefits? Well, about 13% of US citizens, so about 40 million people, have had to resort to SSRIs in order to treat depressions. But what's really interesting is even though SSRIs increase serotonin pretty much instantly, it usually takes some weeks to see effects on mood, which is interesting because we thought low serotonin equals depression. There could, however, be some underlying issues, so along with the various side effects, that's sparking some debate. Okay, in case you want less invasive methods, the first one would be to eat foods high in tryptophan, the amino acid precursor of serotonin, like lean meats, fish, nuts, cheese, along with carbs, as they elevate insulin, which makes other amino acids that compete for the access to the brain go to muscles and organs. Thus, more tryptophan in the blood and more tryptophan in the brain. Next one, exercise. It not only stimulates serotonergic brain cells, but also activates the protein clearance from blood to muscles. More tryptophan in the blood, and you know the drill. Also, balancing dopamine levels, which you already know some ways. as they inhibit the hydroxylation of tryptophan, which is the slower but crucial step towards serotonin. And finally, stress management and inflammation. So, in your head, there's now this picture: tryptophan, serotonin, melatonin. But in the first step already, tryptophan can choose to go down another path, the kynurenine pathway, which is important in regulating inflammation and immunity. So, more inflammation and stress cause more tryptophan to be redirected towards this pathway, leaving less tryptophan for serotonin production. Other ways include sunlight exposure and also an overall positive mindset. So we've now addressed your motivation and desire with dopamine, as well as the contentment and well-being of serotonin. And you, or your body, were the central element of all of this. Now, you might be inclined to go monk mode for some time, just focusing on your productivity, on your work, ignore all the BS and other people. But you might want to reconsider that choice, because we'll now look at the social aspect of well-being, where you are no longer the central element. And we're going to have a look at oxytocin. Our first question, so what is oxytocin, is already very interesting because it operates both as a hormone and a neurotransmitter. It is believed that it originated as this hormone that stimulates uterine contractions in childbirth and promotes lactation. Over time, it expanded its role to include bonding between parents and offspring, and then bonding between people and overall social interactions. Oxytocin is deeply connected to feelings like trust, calmness, and love. But it's not always the love hormone or the cuddle hormone, as oxytocin also promotes in-group favoritism. So favoring someone of your own group as opposed to an outsider. Many studies found that people of the same group, in this case race, with more oxytocin not only had more empathy towards group members, but would also more willingly lie if it benefited the group. And even though oxytocin's ties to xenophobia are contested, feel free to call it the hormone of racism if you want to, or until research says otherwise. And the thing is, you'll find this guy everywhere. I mean, oxytocin does so many funky things, but how does it contribute to joy? You know, this feeling of warmth or calmness when you're around family or friends. That's oxytocin, and optimizing it can be achieved, as I already mentioned, through healthy relationships and social interactions. Okay, I'm sorry. There's this spray, costs like 25 euros. It 100% has the same effects. With that being said, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done, especially when it comes to the dark side of oxytocin. And lastly, endorphins. When I think of endorphins, I always think of parents or teachers naming some weird ass activity like, did you know that skinning a chinchilla releases endorphins? Now, they usually say chocolate, coffee, or laughing does that, but they follow up with, well, endorphins are the happy chemicals, the fine happy chemicals. And if you said drugs, you would kind of be correct, because endorphins is short for endogenous morphines. And yes, technically the way to think about it is that we have our own endorphin system and other drugs interfere with it. And also the other systems I talked about. Also, endorphins are not literally morphine, but are definitely similar structurally and functionally, because endorphins are opioid peptides that, like morphine, act as painkillers, both in the central and peripheral nervous system. For example, beta endorphin, like all endorphins, is produced and stored in the pituitary gland, and in the peripheral nervous system binds to opioid receptors. This inhibits the release of neurotransmitters like glutamate and substance P, which are important for pain perception. And in this case, what's interesting is that substance P, the P apparently stands for preparation or powder, actually causes T lymphocytes, so white blood cells, the body police, to go to this area, and these T lymphocytes release beta endorphins. Beta endorphins that in turn inhibit the release of substance P and glutamate. In the central nervous system, beta endorphins blocks another neurotransmitter called GABA, which in short causes relaxation. However, less GABA means more dopamine, which makes sense if you think about it. Like, you just experienced pain, you probably hurt yourself. Me personally, in that situation, would much rather prefer the sharp and focused mind of dopamine, along with the motivation to maybe live to see the next day. It's like you got hurt and now you got to do something about it. And how to get endorphins? I mean, at this point, it's the usual sunlight, aerobic exercise, laughter as well. Just living a healthy life in general is probably not a bad idea. So go outside, make some friends, go do something. And with that being said, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and stay tuned for the next one. So, what makes you happy?